Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to the 5th of May, Cinco de Mayo in some circles, also Taco Tuesday in other circles. And this year they kind of fell on the same day, and hopefully you find a reason to rejoice. And if not, hopefully we will give you reason to rejoice as we go to the book of Philippians and we talk about it. That is one of the overarching themes that Paul talks about within this particular book. That is count yourself among those who should be joyful. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Let's begin, however, by encouraging you to place any prayer requests or things of that nature in the chat. We do keep a track of those things. We do add them to our prayer list. So if you have things that we need to be praying for, if you have requests that you would like to make known, then by all means, put those in the chat. We will monitor those. But we're going to begin by reading, beginning in Philippians chapter 1. We did the first few verses, and we're not going to do a verse by verse thing just like we did with the book of James. We are going more kind of by topic, just looking at some of the themes in the book and pulling out some, of the teaching that we can find profitable for us and usable almost instantaneously, so that we can, be encouraged and be strengthened by the message that Paul was giving us. Beginning with verse 12 of the book of Philippians, Paul writes, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. So that last word there tells us that Paul is in prison. Paul is in prison, and he writes this book. And that's one of the big conundrums, I guess you could put it that way. One of the big mysteries, I believe, of the book of Philippians, but it is something that should be encouraging to us, is that Paul is in prison. Paul is in a difficult time. Paul is going through a trial. You may recall that, Paul was pursued by his fellow, Jews, put out of Jerusalem. He had to flee there. He makes an appeal to Caesar, and that appeal, takes him to, Rome. But it's a life-saving measure at first. But he ends up in Rome, and here he's basically claiming that because of all of these things, because of the persecution, the trial, and no doubt even the shipwrecks and the beatings and all of that along the way, have actually worked out to the greatest good. And this is one of those instances that we sometimes talk about when we go to places like Romans, 8 and 28. Those are Paul's words. God is working all things to our good for those who love him, right? Paul is giving you an incidence of this here. He says, look, this is not an ideal situation. It's prison. Later, when he writes Timothy and encourages him near the end of his life, you can tell that he's just downtrodden and distraught, and he wants Timothy to come, and he feels a sense of loneliness and all of that. But when he writes the book of Philippians, he is upbeat. Despite the fact that he is in this trial. And the reason that he is upbeat and the reason that he's so, joyous seems to be because his mission has been accomplished despite all of the efforts of humanity, despite the wrath of man coming down upon Christians and persecuting them. It seems as if he's been able to accomplish the mission that he was given by God to do, and that is take the gospel to the world, but specifically take the gospel to the Gentile world. Ultimately, that takes you to Rome. That takes you to the highest concentration of Gentile people. So Paul says, look, I've been able to accomplish this mission. So I want to point out three things today for you to kind of take away from this. The wrath of the gospel, the wrath of man, I should say, brought trial upon Paul. But despite that, number one, the gospel was able to flourish and actually turn the efforts of men on their heads. Notice what he says in that very first line. He says this, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me really served to advance the gospel. He says it as if almost it's the opposite of what you would expect. right? When the persecution comes, the expectation is that the persecuted will simply bow before the persecutor and do his will or do his bidding. Or the outcome, because of the great strength of the Roman Empire, would have squashed anything that Paul was trying to do. But what the Roman Empire didn't know is that God was on his side. God was the one opening these doors. So these wrathful efforts of men against God and against Christ and against what Paul is actually teaching actually turns out to be the mechanism by which the preaching of Paul can flourish in this land among the Gentiles that Paul is supposed to go to. So the very thing that they mean for bad ends up being good for the mission that Paul says. Now, for us, I think this is just a wonderful lesson. We take situations like we're in now, and we can moan and we can complain and we can, kind of, bow to the pressure of, the current crisis. Or what we could do is have the mentality of Paul. We rejoice in the Lord. We rejoice in the Lord. And because we're rejoicing in the Lord and not our circumstance, then we embrace the good things that we can find in this circumstance, and we can take them back out into the world and encourage people. So that when people look at us and when people consider our lives and consider the way that we're acting and consider the way that we're behaving, they're going to be just as surprised as no doubt, the Philippian brethren were when they received this letter. They must have thought, oh, poor Paul, in prison. I mean, that's a bad situation. That's rough. And, he's got to have it. And, just keep your head down and go along with the flow. No, Paul used it as a pulpit. He took the positive things from this trial and he turned it into the wonderful good news of Christ, or an opportunity to spread that wonderful good news. We have that same opportunity right now. We have an opportunity to find the good things in all of the goings on that currently are happening around us, and we can use that as an open door to spread the gospel. Point number 2 that I think we can make from the context that Paul gives us is that his persecution, his rising above the trial and using this persecution as an opportunity to preach the gospel has inspired others, right? People who would otherwise maybe have sat back and said nothing were inspired to actually stand up and begin speaking the word of God, and maybe even change their behavior, change the words they speak. Paul says, look, and most brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. In other words, they were fearful, they were cowering, they were not saying and doing the things that they needed to do, but because they saw Paul step out and do something good, they too were willing to step out and do that something good. I think there are a lot of people who are wanting to embrace the positive. There are a lot of people who want to, find that answer that gives them hope and gives them peace and gives them, a sense of not just belonging, but a sense that, all of this is for something. And they're just waiting to hear that encouraging, message. You be that encouraging message. Take the current crisis, use it, speak boldly the good news, let people know, look, there is an answer. Even if it all falls apart, even if, this thing ends up consuming, more than we ever thought it would, we can use that to encourage people to give their lives to Christ and to be the person that they need to be spiritually. What you do inspires others. There's somebody always watching. I remember from the time I was a kid that teachers would tell me this, and sitting in a high school class or a middle school class, you tend not to believe that, right? I mean, who's looking to me? Who's seeing my example and following that example? But the older you get, the more you realize that's true. And when we're negative and when we're moaning or when we're groaning or when we're not doing the things that we should be doing, that sets that negative example. But if our example speaks the good news, speaks to the powerful and the positive, it speaks of rejoicing like Paul does throughout the entirety of this book, then that's the message we're going to give people, and we're going to encourage them to do the same. Rejoicing is infectious, right? Your behavior, your attitude is infectious, and you can and will affect the people around you. But you need to take the steps to do that. Paul stepped out, and then it was on these other people to see that example and further step out. So are you stepping out? Are you stepping out for the good news? And then the final thing I think we want to mention here is that this choice on Paul's part, when he brought when the trial was brought to him, and his choice to use it as an opportunity, to use it as a means to preach the gospel, not only inspired others, but it brought a necessary judgment. It brought a necessary judgment. Notice at the end of those verses, Paul divides some of those brethren who were inspired into two different groups. He said that there are some that are preaching it, and they do it out of love, and they that he was put there for the defense of the gospel. They realized that Paul providentially was placed in Rome to give an outline, to give the defense for the gospel of Christ, so that many people there would believe it, see it as legitimate, and follow it. But then there were others who had some other selfish gain. We're not told exactly what all of that means. We do know that some of them thought that maybe it would cause Paul more affliction. So it seems as if they are kind of rivals. But the long and short of that is that they were doing it for a wrong motive. But you see, this happening kind of drew the line in the sand. It drew the line in the sand. Okay, what are you going to do? Are you choosing proper motives and proper actions? Or, are you choosing things that are just simply selfish? This ordeal of Paul and the way that he acted in it kind of drew that line so that we could tell and we could see that judgment between these two groups of people. What is in their heart? What is the thing that is driving them? You see, when you take that good news, that good message, and even in times of trials, you proclaim it, some people will be convicted and inspired by it. Other people will not embrace it the same way, and perhaps even reject it. But there's a judgment. See, the gospel requires you to make a decision. The good news requires you to embrace it or to reject it. There is no middle ground. And when that gospel is declared, that good news is proclaimed, then great and wonderful things can happen. Great conviction can happen. And also great judgment happens. Because now we know, and we have to make a choice. And in making that choice, we can choose one of two things. To be like the people who proclaimed it out of selfishness, think only of themselves, and thus receive that condemnation. Or we can be the people who embrace it, listen to it, follow it. After all, it is good news. But again, let me close by simply saying, Paul in Philippians, it gives us an amazing book that is encouraging, that is strengthening. And I think for you and I, what we can take from this particular section, and there are a lot of things that we can take, and maybe we'll come back and revisit some of those things, but I think one thing that we can take with us today is that you and I have received the good news. If you're listening to this message, then no doubt you have received the good news of Christ, that he came here and he died to the saving of your soul. Have you embraced that message? And now, even in this current crisis, are you looking for opportunity to take that message, that joyful message, and bring it to the lives of other people? I thank you for joining me today. This has been your Daily Dose.